Matt, first of all, could you give me an idea of your own relationship with Pee-wee Herman before you got to know Paul?
Well, I was a big fan of PeeWees Playhouse as a little kid. I was totally transfixed by that show. I would say that it really was my first relationship to art that I had an emotional relationship with. I wouldn't have been able to put words to it. But I had that kind of iconic pull string Pee-wee doll dangling above my bed, and it stayed there through my adolescence, and Pee-wee became a sort of touchstone for me. And years went by, and I was, had become a documentary filmmaker. And as you know, I've made films about unconventional visionaries, queer artists, and cultural figures, and a lot of people who sort of were ripe for reappraisal. And in some ways, Paul Reubens fit right in, but in other ways, he didn't because he was such an iconic and well-known person. But I had a sense that Paul, who was little known as himself, would be a compelling subject for me.
Yeah. And how do you think you being a gay filmmaker factored into maybe him agreeing to do the film or the way that you were able to connect, perhaps?
I mean, I think being gay was a point of connection and a point of kind of friction between us sometimes because Paul very much wanted to come out in the documentary. That was the decision he had made before I came into the mix. But I think he was also concerned that I would make the film overly focused on his sexuality or on telling the story from a queer lens. Paul didn't want to be depicted as a gay icon. That wasn't his interest. And obviously, I saw a lot of complexity there in his decision to live in the closet for his career and what the long-term repercussions of that were for him and how the arrests and media controversies he experienced, to some extent, were a result of him leading a very anonymous private life. So, I think Paul felt comfortable to discuss coming out and discussing his sexuality with me, and I felt in other ways he was at odds with me over that issue.
Yeah. And when it came to the day when you were shooting that part of the interview, when he was talking about being gay, it seemed like it was something that he very rarely talked about and had only really kept to his inner circle, certainly sort of later in life. Um, how was he during that time? Because you include quite a few sequences where we see him be quite barbed, and it usually ends up being playful. But was he sort of less tricky and a bit more
Stressed? No,
straightforward on those
no.
days?
He was really stressed. He was really squirmy. And I told him I was there to support him. And when he did come out, it was like, 1,000 pounds lifted from his shoulders. I think just being able to broach the topic, being able to discuss it and to stop overthinking it and to just go there, I think was a relief to Paul. And, it was a very emotional day. He talked about his boyfriend from art school named Guy and what happened with Guy and their relationship, and also Guy's passing from AIDS. Paul met with him, as you know, several hours before he passed away. And so not only was it, I think, cathartic for him to discuss his own sexuality. It was intensely emotional for him to discuss that relationship and the death of that partner. I think it was, I can't speak for Paul, but I know that he called me afterwards saying that he felt exhausted by it, but he seemed very relieved.
And there's beautiful Super 8 footage of Paul and Guy's, home life, really. Could you t talk a bit about including that in the film?
Yeah, I mean, Paul had shot a lot of Super 8 from the late 1970s at a particular time in his life that usually isn't well documented for someone like Paul. His private life was well documented, but the most striking and moving material from that Super 8 was footage of his life with Guy in their Echo Park apartment with their cat Coco. It was just very revelatory. When I saw that footage the first time, I cried. I was just taken aback by the intimacy and the beauty of it. And I don't think Paul had seen it probably since the period in which it was shot. So I wasn't there when he watched that footage, but I can only imagine what it felt like to see that stuff again for the first time.
Yeah, and I see that section of the film's really resonating with a lot of people, and the AIDS Memorial shared a post about it yesterday on Instagram, didn't they?
Yeah. Yeah, I saw that and I think a lot of people are moved by that story and very curious to know more about Guy, who was this very radiant and compelling person who we don't hear from, obviously, but who begs to be known in his own right.
And it's a really touching footnote that Paul did have someone in his life, a romantic partner, or someone was there at the end of his life.
Yeah, I don't know much about that relationship. It's something I found out about through Allison Berry, who was Paul's assistant for 40 years and now is the executor of his estate. And she told me as much as Paul would have told me, I think, or more, in just that he was in a relationship. He was really happy and surrounded by loving people at the end of his life, even though he died very, very, very privately.
Yeah. And to some extent, this feels like it's a film about the relationship between documentary subject and filmmaker. And I wondered sort of how far you'd agree with that, how aware of that you were as you were, shooting the
Yes.
film and assembling it.
That was something I was interested in exploring, and so was Paul, but only in service of the theme of control. I think Paul was somebody who had an extraordinary sensitivity around control. He wanted to control everything. And that's really because he lost control of his personal narrative in the media. And so, our dynamic was interesting because we had a lot in common, and we had a connection, but we also were often in conflict. There was a power struggle between us. But that power struggle wasn't so much about me, it was about Paul's internal wrestling, whether he would be willing to share that much of himself. And so I decided to include that in the film to kind of create more psychological depth for the portrait of Paul and to understand both his issues of control, but also his reluctance to share his personal life.
And having 40 hours of interview footage, what were your kind of guiding principles as you went about deciding what to include?
Well, of course, there was just the whole kind of chronological biography of Paul and how that interwove with the story of Pee-wee Herman. So it's like when you make a film, you're like braiding. There's different threads, and there was obviously the Pee-wee thread, there was the Paul thread, and then there was the thread of our relationship and his own relationship to being a documentary subject. So I was constantly braiding those back and forth, trying to create some symmetry and logic around it. But the main thread was Paul. With 40 hours, you have the ability to tell the majority of the story in the voice of a subject, which is so rare. So yeah, I had a sense of the beats of his story that I wanted to cover, and it was thoroughly kind of contained within that interview.
And the interviews feel so immediate. I think, well, why did you decide to use the Interrotron method where, he's really looking directly at us, the viewer, and he was also looking at you as you were asking him the questions, obviously.
Yeah, it's interesting because a trope of Pee-wee's Playhouse is that Pee-wee would often look directly into the camera and speak to the kids. And so I wanted something like that, but a little more conversational. And it's a device that's used quite a bit. I think what's people are reacting to is how close Paul is to the frame. So you really feel like when you do see him, you feel very intimately close to him, but also it in some ways makes you feel like you're in his head, you're in his brain. And so that level of intimacy was something I felt could be achieved with that device.
And Debi Mazar is a contributor. You don't include that many contributors or talking heads, but why did you want to include her, and what kind of interested you about the relationship that she had with Paul?
Well, Debbie's a really compelling person, period. And, it may seem like there's not that many, but there's over 15 other people in the film. Paul's just such a gravitational force that you don't notice the rest of them so much. But, Debbie's relationship with Paul was really interesting to me because I think in a lot of ways she sort of saved him. She brought him out of reclusivity and darkness and brought him back out into the world. She also, I think, some people might say was a beard. I don't think that's the nicest language to use to discuss that relationship because I think she was a devoted friend and that their relationship, I think, transcended labels, but she got him out in public on terms that he was comfortable with. But she also saw that here is an artist who's going to perish if he doesn't create, and I'm going to surround him with the love and support that he needs to move beyond the controversies that are overshadowing his life. And so she just seemed like an essential figure in his life. And while some people may have perceived them as being in a romantic relationship, I think it was always kind of a queer relationship, and that Debi was somebody from New York City and downtown who was not fazed by that sort of thing and understood the fluidity of these boundaries.
And I love your use of clips from all of Paul's work, and especially the Pee-wee's Playhouse clips. What kind of struck you as you revisited that as an adult, particularly the sort of the queer and the non-conforming elements? And I mean, it's kind of sad, but you see the sequence of him walking around in heels, which is amazing to watch. And it's hard to imagine that being made today,
Yeah,
allowed
totally.
to be put out in the world, or sort of the kind of
I mean,
fake
watching
outrage that would happen if it was.
yeah, watching Pee-wee's Playhouse for me now, just if anything, reinforces how influential it was to me. Seeing it now, I'm like, wow, that really shaped who I am. It shaped my sensibility and my taste and my point of view. And I wouldn't say it's surprising, it's delightful, but that within that delight is a sense of recognition of I see kind of where my sensibility comes from. This is really an origin point for a lot of things that resonate and reverberate in my brain.
Yeah. And when it comes to dealing with Paul's legal troubles, to what extent did you see both the arrests and the media coverage kind of laced with homophobia?
The first arrest, not so much, I don't think homophobia was the case. I think that it was the division between Paul and his alter ego that collapsed and backfired at that moment. But, Paul was somebody who had had a sex scandal in the media. He was had been a children's entertainer, and he was a closeted gay man. So he was walking around in some ways with a target on his back. And with regards to his second arrest, that alleged possession of child pornography, I always, without even knowing much, kind of suspected that there was a kind of homophobic witch hunt at play. And when I examined the facts and went in depth on that case and what happened, that became clear to me. So I think it's best presented as facts in the film, but I think I always had the perception, and that perception was confirmed that he endured a homophobic witch hunt.
And what was it like getting to explore that amazing archive that he has, just his collection of well, all kinds of things. I mean, you filled a warehouse to show
Oh, I
us.
mean, it's extraordinary. He had the most extraordinary sensibility, and it's so unusual that somebody can just kind of massively collect all the things that inspire them. It was this amalgam of kitsch and art and ephemera and books and collectibles and junk. I mean, it was just beyond. It was sort of like being in Paul's brain, which was really satisfying.
Yeah. Do you know what is happening to any of that right now?
They're making plans, but I don't know exactly what they are or when they're ready to tell everybody what they are.
And at one point, Paul says that he would like a kind of dreamy quality to the film, and I think certain
Oh,
sequences do feel like beautifully dreamy. And I just wondered why you
thank you.
thought that
I
was.
think I think that's part of why he wanted to work with me as a filmmaker is that he saw aspects of that dreaminess in the way I render portraits of people, and he wanted that for his own film. And I said, you chose the right guy. That's my sensibility, and I think we wanted similar things in terms of the making the film, even though the process was very difficult. I think we had in mind a similar film.
Yeah. Well, Matt, well, thanks so much, and
Thank
congratulations
you so
again on
much,
you
James.
was
It's
in
great to
play.
meet you. Appreciate it.